Hey guys, this is Spinda for GrinderSchool.com with my second part of four lecture plus video series. This week we'll be concentrating on a simple but often misinterpreted idea called continuation betting. First to start, I think we need to define a few terms that we'll talk about a lot throughout the lecture and the live play. First is going to be the definition of a continuation bet. And in its simplest form, a continuation bet is a bet from the preflop aggressor on the flop, i.e., we raise preflop from the button, the big blind calls, the flop comes 3 cards, he checks, we bet. That is a continuation bet. We are continuing our aggressiveness from preflop to the flop. The next term we'll want to define is board texture. And it's very hard to make an actual definition for board texture. Believe me, I've tried. The best I could come up with is the connectedness of the 3 cards on the flop. And we'll go even into more detail in the next slide and further slides on exactly what I mean. But basically the board texture is the 3 cards that flop and how they relate to each other. All right, whether it's a deuce 7 jack flop of all 3 different suits, or whether it's an 8, 9, 10 flop of all 1 suit. Those would be different board textures. All right. The last thing I'll talk about is what I will term as calling range, and this could better even be called preflop calling range. And this is basically the set of hands of which an opponent might call a preflop raise. All right. So we'll be talking a lot about our opponent's range for calling our preflop raise and how that relates to the board texture and whether or not we want to make a continuation bet. All right, now since we have these basic definitions in hand, what we'll be talking about throughout this video are 2 concepts. The first concept will be profitable spots to continuation bet. And basically we'll be looking at a few different factors to determine whether or not we can profitably bet in certain spots. The first factor we'll look at is choosing the correct board textures, whether that be a wet board or a dry board. Okay. The second factor in picking the profitable spots, is choosing the correct opponent, and we'll discuss what opponents are more profitable to continuation bet, whether that's loose players or tight players. All right. The second major factor that we'll talk about throughout this video is continuation bet sizing. All right. And there's 2 sub-factors that go into this as well. Just as in the first one, we're going to be looking at the board texture and how that relates to the size of the c-bet we want to make. And we'll also be looking at our opponents, whether they're loose or tight or aggressive, etc. And also how that relates to what size we want to be making our continuation bets. So first up will be picking out the right board textures to c-bet. And when we're talking about continuation bet in a profitable spot, we're generally going to be discussing spots where we flopped absolutely nothing. Either we've raised a very small pair before the flop, and it has come 3 higher cards, or we have like an ace high or king high type hand. The first thing we need to talk about is the difference between a dry board and a wet board. So let's go ahead and define what a dry board is. All right, typically a dry board means that there are going to be 3 different suits on the flop. It also means that there is going to be a flop with many uncoordinated cards, and I'll kind of show you some examples here in a second. So the first example is going to be a flop of ace of clubs, 8 of hearts, 3 of diamonds. And on this flop, you can tell that an opponent could not have possibly flopped a flush draw, and the only straight draws an opponent could have flopped would have been a hand like deuce 5, deuce 4, or 4 5 for just a gut shot. So there are no open-ended straight draws, and there are no possible flush draws. So this is about as dry of a board as you can get. The second example is also another example of a dry board, but it has some more likely gut shots on it. Jack 9, Jack 10, are hands that people are more likely to play. Also 9, 10. It still does not have a flush draw, and it has 1 big card and 2 smaller cards. And then the third example would be a paired flop without a flush draw, like the one we see here, 10 of hearts, 10 of diamonds, 5 of clubs. it's very unlikely for a person to have connected with this type of board, and therefore we deem that to be a dry board texture. Now, on the other hand, we need to define a wet board, and it's pretty much the exact opposite. Right? A flop with similar suits, meaning 2 or 3 of the same suit on the flop. Also, a flop with some connected or coordinated cards, and let's look at a few examples here. And the first flop is going to be ace of clubs, jack of spades, 6 of spades. And on this board, while there aren't many straight draws available to an opponent, there's certainly the presence of a flush draw on the board with 2 spades on the board. Therefore, we would deem this more of a wet board. The second board texture would be more of a connected board, 7 of clubs, 8 of hearts, 10 of diamonds. While not presenting a flush draw, there are a plethora of possible straight draws on this type of board texture. And the third one is a monotone or same tone or same suit, flop. Here you can see we have 3 pretty much unconnected cards. However, they are all the same suit. They are all spades. Therefore, we would deem that to be a wet board texture. So just understanding the difference in between dry boards and wet boards will help us to choose some profitable spots in continuation betting, and we'll talk about that on the next slide.